The great Boris Spassky once said to Garry Kasparov, "Squeeze his balls, but just one." And he was counselling Kasparov on how to play against Tigran Petrosian in 1982. So Kasparov kept trying to blow Petrosian off the board in these better positions, and he was counselled to just show some patience. And this game between Friouzja and Carlsen really reminded me of that concept. So I want to take a look at this one. It was played between Magnus Carlsen with white and Alireza Firouzja with black. It was in actually Tartar Steel in 2021. So I'm looking back at some of these decisive results from last year because it's gutting, of course, that Friouzja can't play this year in the Tartar Steel event 2022. So I want to look back at some of these decisive games. So we had this Queen's Gambit on the board. Magnus goes knight to c3. And now we had knight b to d7 from Friouzja. Slightly more unusual, more common is bishop e7, for example. We had bishop to g5 from Magnus, pawn to h6, bishop to h4, bishop to e7. And now we had this takes in the centre from Magnus, and Friouzja didn't take with the pawn here, going in for this Carlsbad structure. Instead, he took with the knight, a kind of hyper-modern way to play. And I say hyper-modern because after these bishops exchanged off, the pawn pushed on to e4 now, the knight captured here, the pawn recaptured, and white has now set up this big centre and has the space. But black, for his part, is going to look to undermine that centre from afar. So bishop to d3 now after castles, and pawn to c5 begins that undermining process. Now we had castles, cd, cd, and pawn to b6 here. A really logical move because this bishop needs to come into the game somehow so you can complete development. And now Magnus goes for a really nice minority attack on the queen side with pawn to a4, launching this pawn forward so that after bishop to b7, pawn to a5, he asks black an uncomfortable question here. Do you want to let me push on to a6 and create a thorn pawn which can be valuable in endgames? Do you want to let me capture here and lumber you with this weakness on b6? Well, Friouzja decides to capture immediately. This does activate the rook, and there's pressure now against this pawn, but at least he's now created some clarity there on the queen side, and he can focus his attention in the centre on undermining these pawns. So we had knight to f6 now from Friouzja, hitting this e-pawn. Now you don't want to push pawn to e5 here. That would be positionally really bad because the knight now lands on d5 and it's rock solid there. You've just killed all the white play dead. So instead Magnus goes rook to e1, and now we had rook f to d8 pressuring in the centre, and queen to a1. A nice move from Magnus, pressure against this pawn now, and you can't actually defend that pawn as black. So instead Friouzja plays queen to c7, seeking to activate this queen by bringing it into here where it pressures the e-pawn, pressures the knight if you ever try to play queen g3 to kick the queen. And now it's Magnus to move, and this is what I mean about squeezing your opponent's balls, but just one. So Magnus doesn't dive in here and take the pawn on a7. Why give black that clarity? Why help them unravel the position? Because after a line like this, rook to a8, you're forced to go queen to c5, takes here, the pawn recaptures, rook c8, you're recouping the pawn. If you try e5, there's knight d7. It's just no good. Black's way back in the game, has equalised the position, nothing to be said. So Magnus doesn't take that pawn on a7, he knows way better than that, and instead he just plays pawn to h3, asking black, okay, what are you going to do now? So Friouzja plays pawn to a6 here. Again, Magnus doesn't take that pawn. He plays rook to c5 instead, kicking the queen, and it comes into f4. Now this pawn is attacked 3 times, and you can't play g3 as said, or your knight drops off. So Magnus goes rook e5 to defend the pawn. Knight d7 hits the rook comes back, knight f6. So an invitation is given here to repeat moves, but Magnus is having none of it. He wants blood, so he goes pawn to d5 here, a really thematic push, because after captures, which you have to do positionally, now Magnus pushes with pawn to e5. You don't recapture here, instead you kick on with this pawn, thrusting into the heart of the black position, forcing the knight into e4, and in giving this pawn, you cramp the black position here, as we can see. It often can help with checkmating attacks, plus you open up this bishop and blunt the black bishop, as we can see. So now we had queen to d4 from Magnus, a really powerful centralizing move. It holds this f2 pawn so that the knight can move in future, and it also eyes this sensitive d5 pawn. Although that's currently protected, if the bishop ever moved, the rook moves, it could be under fire. So we had the rook coming across to the c-file now, and a really nice remaneuver from Magnus now. Many of his pieces are optimally placed, but his rook on a5 isn't anymore, so he drops it back to the back rank. And what we'll see after pawn to a5 is that he's bringing it to the b-file to hit this bishop. This means that Firouzja nudges it into c6 here, and now Magnus misses a trick actually to play in a more powerful way. So he could have played rook to b6, immediately hitting that bishop, and there's actually a threat here. So if you go, say, pawn to a4 as black, well, now you can chop here. After the rook recaptures, queen takes on d5 is really powerful, and this is what I was referencing earlier. So you're hitting these rooks here, you have to do something about that threat, like say rook a to c8, and then you pick up this weak knight, so you win back your piece and some compensation for it. So coming back here, Magnus could have played like that, but instead of going rook to b6, he played in another really interesting and dynamic way. He played pawn to e6 here. So he's now giving a second pawn, which Firouzja just snaps up. So what's he playing at? What's going on here? Well, he's now all in on a checkmating attack. He's 2 pawns down, and this passed a pawn is really dangerous, so you can't afford to go into endgames here. But he's freed up the e5 square when he moved this pawn and created weaknesses around the black king, as we can see. But it is 2 pawns down now. And queen to f6 is a great move from Firouzja. It x-rays the queen here, as we can see. It also supports this pawn, and it moves out of the way of this x-ray from the white queen, so that the black knight is now freed up for activity. So pawn to f3 now from Magnus. He kicks that knight. As said, he really needs to move the black pieces around now and go for broke against the black king. Rook to b6 now from Magnus hits this bishop. It drops back into e8, and now Magnus has to find a way to proceed. How do you actually break through to the king? Well, these pawns are key. They're holding together a lot of the black position right now. So Magnus plays queen to e3, a subtle move setting up ideas of undermining those pawns, because after pawn to a4 here, now we had knight to g4, hitting the queen and unveiling this pressure down the e-file. The queen drops back to d8, hitting this rook, but here we go, an absolute thunderbolt from Magnus. Pause if you want to look for it. Rook takes on e6, an awesome exchange sacrifice and absolutely necessary in the position. You have to go for it now. So Firouzja recaptures here, the queen takes with check, and here Firouzja makes a fatal blunder. He should play king to h8, but it's really not easy to see why he should play like this, because after queen to f5, it looks like you're just getting mated. The only move here to stay in the game is queen to b6 check, after the king moves away, then going bishop to g6. Now you give up a piece like this, and this is why Firouzja would have rejected it, but in compensation you get the a-pawn going, and it's a dynamic balance here where you've got the rook for the 2 minors. Normally that rook would be losing, but with this dangerous pawn and the passed pawn here, it's a kind of dynamic balance. Computer gives it as better for black after a line like this, but who knows what's going on here, to be honest. So I can fully see why, coming back to this position here, Firouzja instead went bishop to f7. Sorry, I should say he didn't go king to h8 here, he went bishop to f7. I can see why he plays this very human reaction, but it runs into an incredible tactic. Pause if you want to look for it. So knight takes on h6 check, just destroying those defenders of the king. Again, it reminds me of Kasparov. He always said, if I was going to chuck a minor piece for a pawn, but it rips open the king position, well, that's just a like-for-like trade, is it not? And this is what Magnus is doing, ripping the position open. And even with just 3 pieces, this king is now getting torn to shreds. These pieces are just way off in Siberia, no help can be given there. So a piece now has to come to this 7th rank to defend this bishop basically. The best way to do this was with one of the rooks, like rook c7. Friouzja goes with the queen here, but now it sets up this sequence of moves. So we had check from Magnus, the king moved across to f8, queen to h8 check, bishop blocks, which is the only move. This rook is key in the whole attack, of course. And now Magnus delivers the hammer blow with queen h6 check. Friouzja actually resigned here. And why did he resign? Well, if you come across with the queen to g7, then you can check here. This is why coming with the rook here was better, because then the queen would still sit on d8, covering this check. But the game would have been lost in a different manner, even if that had happened. And after king f7, queen e7 would be checkmate. And coming back here, if instead of blocking with the queen, black goes king f7, well, now we have bishop g6, just tearing this king to shreds. King staggers up the board, bishop h5 discovered check, king f5 and g4 checkmate. Awesome game by Magnus Carlsen there, turning the screw and then delivering an amazing checkmating attack. If you enjoyed this game, then do hit here to subscribe to the channel, and to see another amazing Friouzja Carlsen game, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.